So if you had to guess 2019, what percentage of the churches in the Washington Conference before COVID, if you had to guess, what percentage do you think that was that were in the growing category?
60.
38? 50? Oh, you guys have faith-based optimism. It was actually 20%.
Welcome to the Propel Podcast, inspiration and innovation to grow your church. I'm your host, Larry Witzel. If God has given you big dreams for growing His kingdom, then this is the podcast for you. Our goal is to offer practical training for effective evangelism in the Seventh-day Adventist ministry context, but the principles we talk about are applicable in many other churches as well. So wherever you're doing ministry, welcome to the Propel Podcast. Well, the 2026 Propel Conference is fast approaching. It's happening in Silver Spring, Maryland, April 12 to 15. If you like this podcast, you're going to love the conference. There's nothing like it to connect with other church leaders, be inspired by amazing speakers, worship together, and gain practical tools to grow your ministry. Discounted registration is still available, but we're just a few days away from the event. So register now at propelconference.org. And I'm looking forward to seeing you there. This episode features Tyler Long, who joined the Navy at age 18, traveling the world on 3 different aircraft carriers, but feeling unfulfilled. In 1999, his life changed after attending an evangelistic meeting at the Oak Harbor Church in Washington State, where he was baptized. Since then, he has served as a Bible worker, evangelist, church planter, and now as the personal ministries director for the Washington Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Tyler has participated in over 100 evangelistic meetings across 4 continents and holds master's degrees in business administration and marriage and family therapy. In this presentation, Tyler Long discusses the critical aspects of church revitalization, focusing on leadership, prayer, and community engagement. He contrasts the devil's plan for distraction and division with God's plan for unity and growth. He highlights the need for intentionality in church culture and the significance of fostering a sense of belonging for every member. We'll hear from Tyler Long in just a moment. First, though, I want to highlight the sponsor of this episode, Advent Source. Advent Source is the official leadership resource center for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America. They provide materials for evangelism and Sabbath school, community-friendly seminars, Pathfinder and adventure clubs, and more. I want to highlight 2 specific resources that are available at Advent Source. The first is a bridge event on creation science created by Dr. Stan Hudson called Origins. And the second is a brand new full message evangelistic series by David Kleindienst called Forecasting Hope. My team has worked with a number of churches who have found both of these resources particularly effective. You can learn more about Origins and Forecasting Hope, along with all of their other incredible resources at adventsource.org. All right, here's Tyler Long's Tuesday presentation from the Church Revitalization Breakout Track from the 2025 Propel Conference. And his topic, Equipped to Fail or Equipped to Succeed.
So when it comes to leadership, and some of you have heard me say this when I've been at your church, what's the first job of a leader? To lead? Okay, yeah. To listen, to serve. These are all good answers. I like to quote Max Dupree, who says, the first job of a leader is to define reality. We're going to talk about revitalization and evangelism. And revitalization and evangelism sound really cool, especially revitalization until you actually do it. And then it becomes challenging because to revitalize a church, and we talk about church revitalization, we're not revitalizing a building. That's just wood and nails and sheetrock. It's actually revitalizing people, families, marriages, the human heart. It's raising the dead. Yeah, can these bones live, right? That's in Ezekiel. I love this quote from former Navy SEAL Jocko. He says, leaders must own everything in the world. There was nobody else to blame. One of the challenges of being a leader isn't just defining reality, but you've got to own it, right? Everything rises and falls on leadership. In any organization, in any church, everything rises and falls on leadership. And you can tell the difference between a good leader and a poor leader is a good leader, they own it. They say it's on me. So when I see only 42% of our churches are currently, was it 42 or 44? 42, that's right. Are in the growing category, I own that. I say, man, that's in my department. And so we're striving to keep improving that. And I'll share some numbers with you. So every church, all of your churches, whether you're in Washington, Idaho, Oregon, Upper Columbia, wherever you're from, whatever conference you're from, every church is in one of 4 categories. So you're actually going to get a homework assignment, pastors, in today's class. A very simple one, but a very important one. So the first group is a multiplying church. I know Jose talked about this. So I actually have the privilege of being on the NAD advisory committee, and we meet every September. And about 6 years ago, we started talking about how to figure out how to define if a church is growing or declining, because one of the challenges is you go into a church that say they average 200 members on Sabbath because the lights are on, they've got things happening, there's classrooms, they feel like it's a growing church because there's lots of people there. But that's not the sign of a growing church. And so the first one is a multiplying. So we had to come up with ideas of what exactly is this. So here's multiplying. And a multiplying church is a church that sponsors a church plant in the last 7 years. And of course, attendance and baptisms grow by 7%. And here's the thing, if your church plants a church, see, one of the fears of church planting is you're sending a core team. Now, there's many churches that have a core team of people they would love to get rid of, right? And send off to, but usually in church planting, you send your best. I think of the book of Acts when the church there in Antioch, the church in Antioch, you know who they sent? They had the Apostle Paul and Barnabas. What if you had the Apostle Paul as your Sabbath school teacher? Or what if Barnabas, that word Barnabas, his name means encourager. What if he was in charge of hospitality and greeting, Barnabas? You're like, yeah, I don't want to send Paul and Barnabas. I'll send other people, but not Paul and Barnabas, right? But when a church plants a church, the mother church that sends the people for like 7 years, they get the same credit as that church plant. So they're not punished. So if your church helps plant another church and that church plant has baptisms, they're also credited to the mother church. Does that make sense? The next is growing. And this is the goal we have. So 42% of our churches right now, as of last year, are in the growing category in the Washington Conference. But 2% growth in attendance, 2% growth in baptisms. So let's make it really basic. So if you average 50 people a week to be a growing church, by the end of the year, you need to average 51 and have 1 baptism. I mean, you could parachute into a community and just start knocking on doors looking for people interested, or go hang out at the coffee shop or the juice bar or what have you, and just connect with people. To have a church and not even baptize 1 person is just, it's heartbreaking. But we have about 30 churches a year in our conference in Washington that have no baptisms. That's like owning a hamburger shop and not selling any veggie burgers for a whole year, that's what you do. That's why we exist as a church. The next is plateauing. Churches don't stay in the plateauing category for very long. Once a church is plateauing, they either go up to growing or they go down to... Now, you asked a good question. You'll see this on all of these down here. These are just some other clues that we've noticed follow the trend of which category they're in. And one of them is the NCD. And I'm going to share with you some examples of the NCD here in a moment. But churches in the, well, let me go back. Churches in the growing, they'll typically average 50 to 65 for an average NCD score. Now, that may not make any sense right now, but in about 10 or 15 minutes, that'll make a lot more sense to you, all right? And then churches that are plateauing, when they take the NCD, that's usually the average score. And you can also see that the age as well, what the median age is there. And then, of course, churches in decline. Absolutely heartbreaking. Here's a few more stats about churches. So the North American division averages each church 106, only 42% actually in attendance on any given Sabbath. Conferences in their best years will average maybe 50%. And then, of course, conferences in their worst years will average about 35% in attendance. And we're actually doing a little bit better than that here in the Washington Conference. So we did a study a little over a year ago. This was an NPU study, that's the North Pacific Union Conference. That oversees like 5 states: Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, and of course Washington. And so we did these surveys at pastors' meetings where a little over 1,100 reports came in, and we basically asked 3 questions. We sent the survey out to pastors, and we had a list of all the people that they had baptized in the last year. And the first question was, those that were baptized, did they have any connection to the Adventist church before they were baptized? Like, meaning, were they a kid or a spouse? And then, or were they just somebody who came like kind of off the street and started Bible studies or a seminar? And what we discovered is 48% of people, that was in 2023, over 1,100 respondents, 48% of those that we baptize actually have no connection to the Adventist church. So if somebody ever says all you're doing is baptizing kids or people connected to the Adventist church, that's not accurate. It's about half, but I've got kids. I want my kids to be baptized. You know what I mean? I want them to love Jesus, sure. And so about half of them were from non-Adventist families. And so the next question was, what led you to connect, or what led them to connect with the church? Now, there could be a number of touch points here, but we were really asking what was the main thing, the number, like the main thing that helped them connect with the church. And notice, 46, like nearly half, they were invited by a member, right? That's that friendship evangelism, that personal invitation. Or they attended on their own. A little side note, before somebody ever comes into your church, they always go to your church website first. And so I want to give you your first homework assignment. Sometime today, go and look at your church website and ask the question, is it up to date? First, is it up to date? Is it easy to navigate? Is it, cell phone user friendly, meaning it's not just, you don't just have to be on a, full screen computer, but is it adapt to the cell phone? But is it up to date? And because everybody, especially when new Adventists, I shouldn't say new Adventists, when Adventists are new to your community and they move into your community and there's a number of churches, they go church shopping. They visit the different Adventist churches, and the Adventist church they go to first is either the one where they know somebody who invited them or the website looked the very best. So you'd be amazed. I've gone on church websites, even in my own conference. Every church I speak at, I go to the website before I speak at the church to see what it looks like. And there are some websites, it has, hey, this coming Saturday night, March 3rd, 2018, we're having a potato roast. It's like, well, that was like 7 years ago, it's pretty bad. It's not just up to the pastor to check those things. Go to the church website, look at it. Is it up to date? And then finally, what led this person to make a decision for baptism? And the top answers were Bible study, evangelistic seminar, church service. Again, these were also important, and these most likely, the smaller ones, they could have easily played a role in that, but we were asking what was the primary thing. There could have been multiple touch points, but what's the primary thing? All right, so back in 2019, when we started really looking at the church vitality, growing, multiplying, plateauing, declining. In 2019, I did a study of all the churches in the Washington Conference. So back in 2019, I wanted to know how many churches were in the growing category. So this was before COVID. So if you had to guess 2019, what percentage of the churches in the Washington Conference before COVID, if you had to guess, what percentage do you think that was that were in the growing category? 20%. So this was, like in 2019, this was before COVID, 69 of our churches were in decline, meaning they were dying, they were shrinking, and it's gotten to the point, I'll get in just a second, where in some cases, church either has to change or die. I mean, sometimes when somebody goes to see a doctor, and I've got alcoholics in my family, where the doctor says, you either quit drinking or you're going to die. It's not an easy conversation to have. You either quit smoking or you're going to die. Sometimes churches need to have a blunt message of, you either change or you're going to die. And it's not being mean, it's actually a message of love. When you look at 2020, there's a huge asterisk there, because 2020 was even worse than 2019. And then 2021 got a little bit better, and then it started going up 22, 23, 24. And we'll see what happens in 25. I will say, of the churches that are participating in Pentecost 2025 in the Washington Conference. So some of you, your church is, if you're in Washington, this applies to you, your church is participating. Every quarter, I email your pastor a couple of things. And I'm not throwing people under the bus. I hope it gets shared with the board. I hope it gets shared with the church. Every quarter, I email pastors 3 things. Number 1, I tell them, this is where you were last year. This is what your category was last year. The next thing I show them is to be a growing church when 2025 comes to an end, so kind of starting with the end in mind, these are the prayer goals. These are the numbers you have to hit for attendance and baptisms if you want to be in the growing category by the end of 2025. Then every quarter, the third number I show them is, here's where you are so far this year. Are you ahead or are you behind? I call them prayer goals because I want them to be shared with the church board. And it doesn't fall on the pastor to solve all the problems. When we believe we're the priesthood of believers, right? We're not Catholics, like the pastor's not the Pope, you know what I mean? And so it takes everybody in the church. It takes the whole board. So it doesn't just fall on the pastor, but the idea is to share that information with the board and say, hey, this is where attendance is, this is where baptisms are. Let's pray about this. What ideas do you have? What Bible studies are we doing? What are we planning? In other words, what is it that we're not doing now that we need to do to hit these numbers by the end of 2025? And those are the conversations that need to happen. I wish I had more time. I'd share some more slides, some more quotes with you from Ellen White, from the church manual, from the pastor handbook. But in a nutshell, the purpose of the church board is to talk about evangelism and church growth. That's the number 1 reason. And so if there's things that occupy too much time for the church board, they need to be taken care of by other committees. The purpose of the church board is to talk about evangelism, soul winning. Here's where we're at. Here's the numbers we need to get. What do we need to do? Now, we've taken a number of churches in the Washington Conference through church revitalization. I think we've worked with about 12 churches here in the Washington Conference. And when I work with a church in revitalization, I'm going in there as, I'm not a dictator. I go in there and I say, here's some things you should do. Here's some things you got to look at. I'm not the boss of anybody. I can't tell the church board what to do. I simply say, here's what I would do if I were in your shoes, because I can't speak to the board and tell them do this or else, But here's what I would do if I were you. And so, I'm working, with lay leaders, volunteers. I got to keep that in mind. So here's one of the churches that started revitalization. I'll go back just a couple of years. So in 2023, these are churches that finished their first year in revitalization. They had 14% growth in attendance. They had 6 baptisms. Church 2, 47% growth, 15 baptisms. Church 3, 64% growth, 7 baptisms. Now this church right here, again, I won't say the name because I don't want to embarrass this church, but it's in the Washington Conference. And when we started revitalization, I said to the board, hey, this isn't a marriage. If at some point you're like, this isn't for us, let me know. I'd rather you tell me, we're not having this, thank you, Tyler, but no thank you. Tell it to me, because I don't want to waste your time. I don't want you to waste my time. So about 4 months into the process, the board voted they don't want to do it anymore. This is how they finished their year. They had 13% drop in attendance, and I praise God for the one profession of faith. But it's interesting, the contrast. I didn't want them to drop out, but now as I look back, I'm kind of glad in a way that they did, because I can now see the contrast between a church that dropped out and a church that actually stuck with the journey. So this last year, 2024, church number 1 was I'll tell you this church, this was our Seattle Phil-Am church. Our Seattle Phil-Am church. They finished last year 31% growth. They had 6 baptisms, 3 profession of faith. For the last 7 years, this church had been in decline. For 7 years. You look in E-Adventist under vitality, and I'll give you some screenshots. 7 years, decline. Finally, 2024. This was the greatest growth in attendance and baptisms this church has ever had in a single year. Here's church number 2. Another church that we worked with last year, 41% growth in attendance. They had 6 baptisms and 2 professions of faith. This is church number 3, and they had 10 baptisms and 2 professions of faith. And so what we do as a church is there's a program we use, and every church is in this program. Now, this is a church from the Washington Conference. I purposely hid the name. This is E-Adventist. And in all of your churches, those who have access to the account in your church is usually the pastor and the church clerk. So not just anybody has access. Now, I have access to every church in the Washington Conference. So at any time, if anybody says, where is my church? Where are we at? Call the conference. I'll get back to you within 24 hours. I'll let you know. So what this does here, I need to kind of hop around. Sorry if I'm gonna block you. So this right here, the arrow shows the attendance. This is the average attendance each year. This right here in the little brackets, here it says 0 weeks. This right here is the number of weeks this particular church throughout that year actually plugged in their attendance. So if it says 0 weeks, that means they never, not once, that whole year plugged in attendance. And so here's what happens. If a church doesn't plug in any attendance, the system by default plugs in its own number, and that number is 40% of whatever the membership count is. Does that make sense? So if a church never plugs in their weekly attendance, and let's say this church averages 100 people each week, has 100 people on the books, 100 members on the books, then the number it automatically would plug in would be 40 people. So this number 36 in attendance, that's 40% of whatever their membership is. So that's how that works. And so you can see here, wow, 97%, growth. Well, that's not accurate, they only took 19 weeks, which is, little over a third of how many weeks there are in the year, but it's comparing it to 36, which is not an accurate number. And so it looks at attendance, it looks at baptisms, and of course, to be a growing church, this number has to be 2% here, and this number has to be 2% here. Actually, it has to be over 2%. It has to be at least 2.1. I kept telling people 2%, 2%, and you'll hear that, and forgive me, but the way the system is, it actually has to be at least like 2.1%. So it's got to be just slightly a hair over. And then finally, it'll tell you where their overall vitality is. And this is, of course, applied if they've planted a church. It'll show that they've had a church there. So we know if they're, a multiplying church. But you can see this church is all over the place. But again, some of these early ones aren't completely accurate because this vitality is only as accurate as the attendance, the baptisms, the input that actually gets plugged in. I got to add this because we're looking at numbers here. And it's easy to fall in the trap. Like I look at this number, they had 1 baptism. That's a number. But it's not just a number. That's a person. That's a human being. When you look at numbers on a spreadsheet or things like this, kind of in my world, it can start seeming more business-like and not spiritual, and I don't want it to be that way. We have to track things, right? You've got to count things. In the book of Acts, somebody counted 3,000 were baptized at Pentecost. And I always say this, I don't know how they ended up on such a beautifully rounded number, 3,000, did they round up or, was he an evangelist and just rounded up? So, but each of these numbers here is a person. They're part of a family. They have hopes. They have dreams. The Holy Spirit's working in their life. And so we've got to constantly remind ourselves of that important principle. But here's why it's important to keep track of things, is the idea that you can't improve what you don't measure. If you went to the doctor to get an annual physical exam and the health assistant, whoever checks you in, the first thing they do is they say, get on the scale, right? And if you're like me, I take my shoes off, I empty my pockets, my belt, I'm like, I'm gonna give myself a fighting chance, and it doesn't matter what I've been eating or lack of exercise. In my mind, I always think somehow I can trick the scale.
Or the scale's broken.
Yeah. And I'm like, but the scale is usually not very, very nice to me. But they take your weight, then they put that thing on your arm and they pump it, then the thing on your finger for oxygen, and maybe they check your cholesterol. But imagine going to get an annual physical exam and you notice they're not writing or recording any numbers in your chart. You'd probably say, hey, what's going on? And the doctor comes in and says, yeah, we don't really track numbers here. They're not important to us. But what about my blood pressure? Yeah, that number's not important. If you got high blood pressure, is knowing that number important, yes or no? That could be the difference between life and death, right? So you got to know your numbers. And this is why I send things every quarter. Now, I'm just doing it this year for churches that are signed up for Pentecost 2025. I've really enjoyed working with E-Adventists. It's actually a ministry now, I believe, of the North American division. And the guy there, I'm always I'm not trying to brag here, but I'm going to brag a little bit on the Washington Conference. Like, I feel like out of every conference out there, like we are so invested in this that as we're using it, I'm always sending them ideas on how to update it, improve it. Where the next idea I have is, I don't want to have to email pastors their quarterly numbers. Why don't we just let the system do that for us? Why work harder instead of working smarter? Is that how it is? Or is it work harder and not smarter? I don't know, it's something like that. You know what it is, right? And so now a question was asked about NCD. NCD stands for Natural Church Development. Thousands upon thousands of churches have taken the NCD. Within Adventism, in fact, I should mention this. I am going to mention it. Andrews University owns the rights to NCD North America. So NCD started off as a ministry to evaluate the health of the local church, and it started off by non-Adventists. So it was non-Adventist. And sometimes people have a hard time with that, using any resource or anything that's not Adventist, which I find interesting because if you look in our hymnal book, have you ever counted how many hymns in our hymnal book aren't written by Adventists? But that's okay, right? That's okay, but anything else. But my point is this, because we own the rights to this now, the Adventist Church in North America has had a huge influence on NCD. So like 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, I went to Florida, which, if you got to go to get coaching done, why not go to Florida, right? So I went to Florida to be coached on how to be an NCD coach. And there were like 30 pastors in the room of this hotel, this conference room. The 2 instructors were both Seventh-day Adventist ministers that were doing all the coaching. But out of the 30 pastors out there, only 4 of us were Adventists. The 26 were from all different denominations. And the 2 pastors that were doing the coaching were unapologetically Seventh-day Adventists. And they talked about the Sabbath and our health message, our education, all that stuff. So they were really good ambassadors. But what NCD is in a nutshell is you're taking your church to see the primary care physician for an annual physical exam. That's what this is. NCD consists of 90 multiple choice questions. It's a survey. There's 90 multiple choice questions. It takes about 30 minutes on average to complete the survey. It can be done either on paper or it can be done digitally online. You would think it's easier to do the digital one, but in the Washington Conference, we've actually found the paper version so much easier for people to do. And I won't take the time to explain that, but if your church ever does the NCD, you're going to hear me say, do the paper one. And I'll explain why if you decide to do it. But do the paper one. So it looks at 8 key areas of church health. So starting from my far right, your far left, looks at empowering leadership, gift-based ministry, passionate spirituality, effective structures, inspiring worship, holistic small groups, evangelism, and loving relationships. So it looks at these 8 areas, and then it gives you your average. Remember when we were talking about the multiplying, growing, plateauing, declining? It had at the bottom the average. So this NCD score is 39. That's the average. Now, 50, getting a score of 50 is like the actual average score of church. Yeah, it's right there in the very middle. Yep, you see it up there. So let me share with you how the average Adventist score looks like. Now, this is a church in the Washington Conference. All right, this is our church. I didn't put the name of our church on it, but this is the church in the Washington Conference. And I actually circled the 2 they scored the lowest on, and I'll get to that here in a moment. But when you look at this NCD score, if you had to guess, would you say this is a multiplying, growing, plateauing, or a church in decline? It's a church in decline, it is, yeah. Here's the average score. So if you were to take all Seventh-day Adventist churches, just Adventist churches, not Baptist or anybody else, just Adventist churches, and figure out our church's average scores on the NCD, this is what the average church gets within Adventism. So notice where we do pretty good at. We're pretty good at evangelism, right? That's one of our better ones. We're pretty good at, what is this? Passionate spirituality. We're above average when it comes to empowering leadership, but notice the 2 we score the lowest in. We don't do small groups well, and we're not very good at loving relationships, are we? When I tell you that in our churches today, we don't do loving relationships very well. Do I have to convince you of that, or does that make pretty good sense? Sometimes we're not very nice to each other. Instead of sending the sick and the hurting to the hospital, we shoot our wounded, don't we? Yeah, we just make it quick and easy. Now, if in any of these categories you had to score the lowest in, because you're going to score the lowest on one of them. No matter how healthy your church is, one of them will be the lowest. This is actually the best one to score the lowest on, holistic small groups. Because when you improve holistic small groups, it actually influences all the other ones. Because think about it, small groups are about loving relationships. Small groups are about evangelism. They're about worship. They're about a structure, spirituality, you know what I mean? Gift-based ministry. So literally, if you have to score low in one of them, that's the best one to score low in. Let me show you another church. But you don't get to this level overnight, you know? What happens is when we see a church like this, it's easy to say, oh, that church, they got lucky. They're an overnight success, right? Lightning in a bottle. Oh, it's because they got the right pastor. I know, I'll be honest, having the right pastor helps because everything rises and falls on leadership. But they did the hard work. You see, to have a church that looks like this is hard. This is hard. It's not easy. This is hard. To have a church that looks like this is also hard. You got to choose your hard, right? Think about that. Like, let me put it into more practical things. To eat healthy and exercise is hard. It's self-discipline. But to not eat healthy and not exercise is also hard because then you're taking a bunch of medications and you're unhealthy. My wife and I, we have a fantastic marriage, but we don't have a fantastic marriage by accident. Having the marriage I have with my wife is hard because the work we put in. But having an unhealthy marriage and going through a divorce and all that is also what? Hard. So when it comes to the health of a church, the point I'm making is you have to choose your hard. No matter what road you go down, it's going to be hard. We just have to choose it. So here's the idea with NCD. I mean, look at this one. Well, of course, it's Tacoma Central, 90, right? I mean, I don't know how much higher you can get than that. But the idea with NCD is you do the survey. Now, like 20 years ago within the Adventist church, when I was a traveling evangelist, I would visit churches and I caught on that there was NCD was popular. Churches were doing NCD like 20 years ago. It was a popular thing. But here's the mistake that was made. Lots of churches would take the survey, they would find out the results, and then that document would go into the drawer, you know, like in the secretary's office or whatever, and then it would stay there until there was a changeover in pastoral ministry, and then that document would probably get thrown away. So just taking the survey isn't doing the NCD. It's applying it. So what we do is we have churches take the NCD. No matter how healthy the church is, we find out what is your lowest factor. So what's the lowest factor here? It looks like inspiring worship service. Even though their lowest is actually higher than the previous church's highest, right? But they want to work on this. This is what they're going to work on. The idea is for the next 12 to 18 months, as a church, we're going to focus on how can we make this better. So what I recommend churches do, and again, when I work with the church, I don't say do this or else, because I'm there to serve. I'm there to minister to the church. I tell the church, start a committee. You know, have the church board meet and have the church board, everybody on the church board write down 2 to 3 names of people that they think are kind of out-of-the-box thinkers, are creative, have kind of an entrepreneurial type mindset, you know. The board, everybody write down 2 or 3 names in secret. And then after you do that, you compile the names to find out where the crossovers, you know. Oh, Susie was mentioned by 80% of the board. Well, Susie's got to be on this team then, you know. And you create a core team, and this team's job is to figure out what do we need to do to improve this, and then bring those ideas to the church board. Does that make sense? That's the best way to go about it, at least from my experience. And then 18 months later, this church will take the NCD survey again with the idea of have we improved our lowest, have we improved our overall average, and now what's our new lowest? And then the cycle repeats itself. So the idea is we're always striving for excellence, always striving for excellence. Now the question I often get from churches or from pastors, because I share stories of like Tacoma Central or Pastor Duart's church, South Center, or Enumclaw, some of these churches that, you know, Bonnie Lake, I think you guys are 2 years in a row now, you've been in the growing category, and people want to know, what are they doing? Like, what's the You know, I like to say, what's the Ozempic of church growth? You know, what's the easiest thing? Like, what's the bare minimum I have to do that will bring the greatest results? You know, about a half dozen things make about 80% of the difference. As church leaders, we want to pour our energy into doing these 6 things really well. Remember, success is not doing extraordinary things, rather, it's doing ordinary things how? I mean, everything you heard from Roger this morning, no offense to him, but it wasn't like, I never thought of it. You know what I mean? It was, I know these things. Now, he organized it in a beautiful way to kind of pyramid going up and going back down. I love that. But a lot of things we hear, it's not like, man, I've never heard this. No, I've heard this. You know, it makes sense. It's practical. The question is, are we going to do these ordinary things, but do them extraordinarily well? Now, I'm kind of a math nerd a little bit. I took a lot of math classes when I was doing, so I should mention this. I didn't follow the typical track to be like a pastor. So forgive me, pastors that are in here, but like I didn't go to seminary. I went to business school, so I got an MBA, and I was working as an evangelist. And people, before I was an evangelist, people said, hey, you're pretty good at giving Bible studies. You want to speak at church? Yeah, I'll speak at church. Hey, you're pretty good like that. And pretty soon I got hired on and took a whole new career path. And so the first thing is prayer. You will never revitalize a church without prayer. You can take the NCD and find out your lowest factor, right? I mean, here in the Washington Conference, we'll send you, if you want a secret visitor, we'll send you a secret visitor. Now, there's a cost for that. It's like $150 plus mileage is what it is. And it's not me. I can't be a secret visitor because when I walk into a church, yeah, hey, I know you. What's going on? But there is somebody I will send to your church. And it's like a 5-page document they fill out. And then I send that document to the pastor with the hopes that that document then makes it to the church board and they can start looking through it saying, okay, what do we need to improve? Because here's what happens and the secret visitor walks through the church, they check out the bathroom, the parking lot. We get so used to like, whether it's our church or our home, like we begin to ignore things, you know? Have you ever walked into somebody's house? Don't raise your hand if this is you. But have you ever walked into somebody's house and it just reeks of their 5 dogs running around? And you're like, how do they not notice this? They don't notice it, do they? If you want to know how your house smells to guests, go on vacation for a week and then come back. When you walk into your house, go, all right, that's what other people experience when they walk into my house, you know, because you get used to it. That pile of books, that frayed carpet, whatever it is, you know, I was speaking at Andrews about a month and a half ago going through some of this, and I used the bathroom at Andrews, and I don't know if it was the water or what, but it smelled like urine in that bathroom. It was probably the sulfur or something in the water, you know, like it absolutely reeked. And I thought, does nobody else notice this? Like, how long has it smelled this way? Like people are spending a lot of money to go to school here. This is our seminary, and you go into the bathroom and like, anyway, if you want to know how clean a kitchen is of a restaurant, look at their parking lot. The parking lot has trash in it, the kitchen's nasty. Because if they can't keep the parking lot up, the kitchen's going to be nasty. I'm telling you, I worked in the restaurant business for a while. That's a true statement. If you walk into a parking lot and it's nasty and there's garbage, go to the next restaurant. Unless you want to take, you know, your own, unless you want to play Russian roulette, right, with your bowel movements, I don't recommend that. So you got to have prayer. You can do everything, you know, this idea, but without prayer, because again, it's God that brings the increase. It's prayer. You've got to revitalize prayer in your local church. All the churches in the Washington Conference that have experienced this exponential growth, the one thing all of them have in common is prayer. Some of the churches have prayer meeting every single night. And there's ways to get creative with prayer. Because if people are wanting to expect you to go to the church 7 nights a week at 7 p.m. for a prayer meeting, it's not that I don't believe in prayer, but, you know, life happens too. And so one of our churches, what we had them do is everybody was assigned to one night, and they would meet on Zoom. So my family with others, we met Monday night on Zoom for 20 minutes to pray. So at least you know that there's always prayer happening 7 nights a week, even though you may not personally be involved with it 7 nights a week. So there's ways to do that. The next is the Holy Spirit. When I read the book of Acts, Acts 1 verse 8, Jesus said, I'll send you the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit does the heavy lifting. The idea that, we just have these, we have great pastors, don't get me wrong, but it's not just on the pastors. It's not just on the church. It's the Holy Spirit working. I was just up at a church, actually it was North Cascade Church, believe it or not. We had a district meeting up there last week, and Pastor Marcia was telling me that you guys had somebody who hadn't been to church for like 50 years. I don't know if you heard that story. Yeah. Person just walked in, and I think Dana greeted her and said, I've been praying for you, or I'm praying for you, or something like that, 50 years. But churches that have been doing revitalization, we've seen people just come off the streets and walk into that church. It's almost like God says, all right, I think you're safe. I think you're ready. I can send this family to you now. You're ready. So the Holy Spirit. The next is faith-based optimism. And in a nutshell, this is the developed the belief in the church that the best days are still out in front. We like to celebrate, man, remember the old pastor, remember the good old days, remember we had 20 kids, but faith-based optimism is the belief that we can celebrate the past, but the best days are still out in front. Then we got to be intentional about everything that we do. This goes back to the secret visitor walking through the church and looking at things. What does the stage look like? Is the front lobby cluttered, right? Is the artwork dated? And this, when we talk about change, we usually do changes on the margins, but I've been to some churches where a dear old saint painted that picture 40 years ago, and it was nice 40 years ago, and you want to honor that, but that person doesn't go there anymore, but their grandkids go there, and if you move that painting, you get in trouble, So yeah, there's challenges that you have to work through, but you've got to go through, and you've got to be intentional about everything you do, from the parking lot experience. So I recommend this. I recommend church boards at your next board meeting, give everybody a clipboard, have them all march out to the parking lot and say, we're going to walk through the church with their clipboard, and I want you to write down anything you notice that's out of place or needs to be fixed. If there's a crack, especially things that deal with risk management. I don't want to go down that road, but our conferences pay out hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in risk management. And insurance over the last couple of years has gone up over 40%. Have you noticed your car insurance or home insurance? Has that gone up? So has risk management. So imagine if a church and a conference pay out, what if they had to pay out $1 million a year in claims? That's 10 full-time employees they could hire on to do ministry work, So you got to be intentional. So walk through the church with the clipboard and write things down. Is the furniture in the front lobby out of date? Is it too cluttered? Is the poor lighting, right? Or just go through and write things down and then see, okay, what are some simple things we can start tweaking and changing right away? And then, of course, there's got to be a level of accountability. And that's why I think every quarter, if you're on the church board, every quarter, you don't just look at your financials, Mr. Treasurer, but you also look at where are we when it comes to baptisms, where are we when it comes to attendance. Every quarter. If you owned a franchise, if you owned a company and you had quarterly meetings, you'd want to find out, how are we doing? How's this franchise doing, right? What's the most popular product that they're selling? What's not selling? Those are things that you would do. And so often I'm like, why does the secular world do better at these things than we do? As a church, we should do way better. So it's about having accountability, and it's also about defining reality. So, is your church in need of revitalization? I love this quote from Henry Ford. He says, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten, right? And so this is really what I'm teeing up here. Notice this quote here on systems. You got to change your systems. The results you're getting in your churches are because your systems are designed for that outcome. If you had 0 baptisms last year, your systems are perfectly designed for that outcome. So if a church had 0 baptisms last year and they're happy with that, I tell them just do what you did last year again this year, right? But if a church had 10 baptisms and are happy with that, I say, well, okay, repeat the process, right? Tweak it, where can you improve it? But just keep working and improving your systems. If you have numbers in mind as a church, and the thing is, you got to have realistic numbers. Now, when we talk about 2%, when I was in the meeting when we were discussing that at the advisory meeting, people said 2%, that's too low. And I said, yeah, 2% is pretty low. As I was doing the math, I was like, 2%, that's like running a 20-minute mile, Yeah, you finished a mile, but 20 minutes really isn't something to brag about, But we decided you have to start somewhere. So we actually looked at what if we did 5%? What if we did 10%? And then we plugged that into the system to see how many churches, if we had 5 or 10% to be growing, how many churches would actually reach that? And it was like nothing. Yeah, we said, well, we got to start somewhere. So we're going to start with 2%, and we're going to go from there. That's what we decided to do. So notice, let me give you a couple of steps here. Step 1, focus on leadership. When the leader gets better, guess what? Every gets better. When it comes to focusing on leadership, it's about the pastor, it's about the church board. I want the pastor to win. That's my goal in revitalization. I want the pastor and the church board to be the hero of their story. I never want it to be, hey, the conference came in, or Tyler. It's always the pastor, the board. They're the hero, the pastor, the board. That's who I want to give all the praise and all the credit to in this revitalization. Not trying to take away the role of prayer and the Holy Spirit, so please don't misunderstand that. But one of the books we have the church board read is a book here called Big Four. And it's called The Big Four. Now, this book's about 20 years old. Some of you recognize this book. You probably read it. It was given out at pastor's meeting maybe years ago. It's called The Big Four because Dr. Kidder studied all the Adventist churches in North America, and he found out that all growing churches had 4 things in common. That's why it's called The Big Four. And those 4 things are empowering servant leadership, passionate and authentic spirituality, committed active laity, God-exalted worship. Those 4 things are 4 of the factors you'll see in the NCD. So we know that this all kind of fits together. In fact, one of our churches, it was our pastor, Alexander, he was pastoring down in Shelton. Here's what he did in his church, is he took this book, and I'm going to share it with you here. He broke it down into 11 sermons based upon the pages there, and he and his elders actually decided they would preach through this book for church services, is what they did, is they preached through this book. So it wasn't just the church board reading the book, but the entire church was able to experience this incredible book. One thing that I think is important for growing churches to do is the church board has to read books together. The church board has to read books together. Friday night, I was privileged to speak at Sunset Lake at a women's conference. Can you imagine? I got to speak Friday night for a group of incredible women. It was fun. I was a little nervous. My wife was shocked. Why are you speaking to women? I said, I don't know. You don't listen to me, honey. You think they're going to listen to me? No, I didn't say that. Right? Yeah, right. Well, here's what I discovered in reading. So Roger Walter said the average American reads 1 book a year. If you read 10 pages a day, in 3 years, you'll have read 40 books. And if you read 4 books on any topic, you will know more about that topic than 90% of the population. Just 4 books on any given topic. So I think church boards should read books together. Not necessarily during the church board meeting, but you read it in advance and you bring that copy and you're prepared in the church board to talk about what you read that week, because the whole idea of the church board is to talk about evangelism. Step number 2, revitalization. You gotta have strategic planning. Now, this is an area that I think as a church we struggle in the most. You've got to decide in strategic planning, what does our church value the most? I preached at a church this last Sabbath, and I talked about having a mission statement. And I went to the church's website. Nowhere on the church website, I didn't see a mission statement. I didn't see a vision statement. I didn't see a list of values. I went into the church. What's their mission? What's their vision? What are their values? I looked at their bulletin, mission, vision, values. None of that. So in my sermon, as I was going through it, we were having kind of a fun game with the audience during the sermon, is I asked the church, who here can tell me what is your church's mission statement? And not a single hand went up. I said, how can we fulfill what God has called us to do if we don't even know what our mission is? Now, I know you could say, well, it's the Great Commission, and I would never split hairs with that, but it's important for churches in strategic planning to find out, what is our mission? What is our vision? What are our values, right? Because you've got to determine, because it's your values that will ultimately drive the culture in your church. The church has to know what they value. So, your values are basically your culture in action. Now, there's 2 types of values in the church. There's the explicit values. These are the things that are written like in the bulletin or on the website. So, for example, an explicit value, it'll be on the church's website. It'll say, we value children's ministries. But then you go to the church and there's no kids there. Or we value, again, I'll say children's ministry, but you look at the budget and there's nothing in the church budget for children's ministries, you know? So we want to make sure that these things align. The next is, and I'm going through this kind of quickly now, because there's the thing I want to get to, is implicit values. And these are the unspoken rules on how things are done. These are the traditions of the church. I was doing an evangelistic series years ago up in Canada, up north in BC, quite a ways up there, until you look at a map and realize, wow, BC actually goes quite a ways up there, yeah. And so I went to Costco because they were having a church potluck, and I was living out of a hotel doing an evangelistic series. I didn't have cooking stuff, so I brought cookies. You know the Costco, the cookie. I brought cookies to potluck, and I put them out there, and then they were gone. Someone put them back in the kitchen. I thought, well, that's weird. So I took the cookies from the kitchen, and I put them back out there again, and they were gone. Like 3 times, and I finally, what's going on? Well, I found out that their potlucks have to be CHIP approved. You know, the CHIP program? They have to be CHIP approved. Whether you want to do CHIP or not, and I said, well, they have chocolate chips in them. So I was trying to tell them, you know, isn't that CHIP? And they didn't think that was very funny. So that was an implicit value. But like what Roger was saying, telling the story, which was fantastic, I mean, I've had evangelistic meetings where we invite people to potluck the next day, and we say, hey, if you're a guest, don't bring anything, we're going to provide for you. But you know, some people they have that gift of hospitality, they want to bring a shepherd's pie, but they use real meat. And then you've got to decide, what are you going to do? My philosophy is you stick it out with a little sign that says real meat. And so these are the different kinds of things that we value. So there's the spoken and the unspoken ones. And again, our values are our culture. And you have to fight for your culture. Culture does not happen by accident. One of the great things about a church plant is in a church plant, you can actually bake into it the culture you want. That's the nice thing about church planting. You create your culture. The challenge with revitalization is you're fighting against a culture, right? And there's some things that are great about the Adventist culture. I love things about the Adventist culture, but then there's some things I'm like, yeah, I don't know why we do that. That just seems to be such a hindrance to us. And so, for example, if you want baptisms to be a part of your church culture, you're gonna like this, Dustin, you'll like this slide, then you gotta make baptisms a celebration. So this was actually at LifeBridge Church. I think this was the Sabbath when they became an official church status. So I got to be there. I took this picture. This was 2 years ago maybe or so. I got to take this picture, and the president was there, and Dustin was there, and the vice president, and the treasurer. And if I remember the story correctly, this young lady here was getting baptized, and all these people in the baptistry had helped connect her to Christ and the church. But who's not in the baptistry is the local pastor. Now he was standing, because that's his son right here, Joel. He was standing like off to the side here, you know, and there was an elder there, but they said, hey, you guys led her to Christ? The elder's there, he helped do this. And so they emphasized the need to have the lay leaders, the elders, involved in this person's baptism. So all the people involved in this small group all got into the baptistry with her. Now, I realize some people would have a hard time with that, and that's okay. You know, some people wouldn't like that. This coming Sabbath up at our Lummi Church, that's up Bellingham on the Lummi Reservation, our conference evangelist Nehemiah is just finishing a series there, and they've got 5 baptisms. They average 1 baptism every 4 years. This Sabbath, they have 5. That would be like your church having like 50 baptisms. That's how big of a deal this is. Even though it's 5, it's huge because there's about 15 people there Sabbath morning. You know, so it's a big deal. And so in fact, their pulpit, the church is small, so their pulpit is huge, but you take the lid off the pulpit and it's the baptistry. Yeah, it's the kind, I don't know if you've ever seen it where the pastor stays dry, but the person gets in and they just kind of sit back. And so I was talking to Pastor Don this morning. I said, hey, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but this is what I would do. Anybody that was involved in the person getting baptized this weekend at Lummi, Pastor, you be up there, you do everything, you have your hands there, but invite that leader to come up and let them also help put together with the pastor, help them, let them be involved in that actual baptism, right? That changes the heart when you get to experience that. When you get to experience that celebration, right? I'm going to go through these kind of quickly here. So number 3, work with your rock star members. Every church has rock star members. You want to tap into them, you want to get them involved, but not just the rock star members. I think everybody in the church that is involved in leading a ministry or department, they should be mentoring and coaching somebody else. They should be working in such a way that they're working to work themselves out of a job. So if I'm in children's ministry, I want to be mentoring somebody who's going to replace me. If I'm in, women's ministry, or if I'm in health ministry, even though it's my baby and I love it, I want to always be coaching somebody, coaching them up so that I can work myself out of a job. I mean, in essence, Jesus for 3.5 years, what did he do? He poured everything in the 12 people, but primarily 3, Peter, James, and John, right? So Jesus purposely mentored and coached up a core group of people. And I think that's the model we should be using in our church today. I think every church should plan annual leadership retreats. Every year, make it part of the church budget where, the church, the church board, the leaders, we're going to rent a big house, an Airbnb somewhere with like 11 bedrooms as part of the church budget. And we're going to go there every year, every fall, we're going to get together and we're going to talk about strategic planning. What's our plan this year? What's our vision? What are the different ministries? What are our main goals? What do we want to accomplish this year? What are our goals from baptism, attendance? You pray about it, you eat together, you play board games. It's really, what it's about is it's about building connections. I mentioned this earlier, the church board should read church growth books together. Every church board should read books together. The board meetings should list the average attendance and baptisms. I mentioned that because you can't improve what you don't measure. I'm hoping this happens, but I think in every church, the pastor should meet quarterly with every department leader. They did a study, the NA did a study of like over 7,000 ministry leaders, like church leaders in the Adventist church, and like 75% came back and said, we don't feel equipped to do our job in the church. So I think pastors should meet every quarter with ministry leaders in the church and say, how are you doing? What do you need? What are your plans? What are your goals? What do you have planned that's going to overall meet the overall mission, vision, and values of our church? And then secondly, what book are you reading right now on, let's say it's children's ministry. What book are you reading? If you're not reading a book on children's ministry, can I recommend a book I can buy for you? Who are you mentoring? Who are you coaching right now? Spend time outside Sabbath hours building connections and trust. I think church board should go out and do things together, eat dinner together, go camping together, like do things together. And the reason is because the church is like any organization, and that is it moves at the speed of trust. So there has to be that connection. My ultimate goal in revitalization is I want to help the leaders of the church. I want the pastor to be the hero of their stories. And if you're preaching Sabbath morning, whether you're a pastor or an elder, share inspirational messages. Never use the pulpit as a way to beat people up. Inspire people. I challenge churches to commit at least 10% of their budget to outreach. I challenged up at the women's children's thing this last Friday. Imagine if churches committed 10% of their budget to children's ministry. So at my home church, where I go to, we have a lot of kids. All these young kids play video games. They play video games online. Their friends play video games. They love video games. So I said, well, why don't we start a video game ministry? We have a really nice gymnasium, nice fellowship hall. What if we were to have a video game tournament where we invited a bunch of kids from the community and neighborhood, had pizza, games, shared a short devotional thought, but then had a video game tournament? And I wasn't quite sure how people would react to that, because I know how things are in the church. It's like that telephone game. You tell one person, they tell another, and pretty soon it's, oh yeah, Tyler's got them playing Mortal Kombat in the sanctuary Sabbath morning. It was a Sunday, it was in the gymnasium, and it was Mario Kart 8 on the Switch, all right? It was Mario Kart 8, all right? So it's a little driving game that shoots mushrooms. I don't know if you have kids that played it. So we had a video game tournament. We had like 20, 25 kids enter it. We had the whole bracket. It's almost like the March Madness, We had a whole bracket board up there, and like it was going down to the final, because in Mario Kart, you can have 4 racers at a time, maybe more, but we had 4. It went down to the final 4. We were there a couple of hours going through this. We had all kinds of game systems set up, and the kids were loving it, having a great time. We had prizes, giveaways, and came down to the final 4. And we had the projector up in the fellowship hall on a big, 10 by 15 foot screen, had the big surround sound going, like it was, and the 4 kids were all sitting in their chairs with their little remotes playing the game, and there was, a bunch of people, standing behind them, kind of rooting them on. And the kid who won, he's a non-Adventist kid, doesn't go to our church. He's the kind of kid that probably doesn't get picked first when it comes to playing sports. Probably the kid that, when you were a kid, remember, I don't know if they do that anymore. It was like so embarrassing because they'd line you up on a wall, then they would start picking people. And if you were ever the last person there, they're like, I guess we'll take them. You know what I mean? Like, it was like how do you shame kids, It was terrible. This would have been that kid. But he knew he was about that win that game. He knew, because you could see all the races going on. He knew he was going to cross, and he stood up with the remote, almost like a mic drop, you know what I mean? Like, he dropped the mic, put his arms up in the air, and people were cheering and clapping, and he was so, you could just tell in that moment, it was like his best day, And we celebrated that as a church, and I got a little heat for that. I had, even from other churches, send me quotes from the Spirit of Prophecy. From the red books, I call them the unread books, because there's some stuff in there they probably haven't read, right? And, but what I did is the ministry leader, the children's ministry leader at the time, I said to her, if this thing is a success, I want you guys to take all the credit. But if this thing bombs and people call the conference office and they're angry, I want you to say this was Tyler's idea. That's the idea of being a leader, right? You give the credit to other people, but you say, I'll take the heat. Yeah, you tell them this was Tyler's idea. He wanted to do this. And so, I gave them the credit, and it was fantastic, So you want to lead by example. Totem pole. This is the totem pole. I live in La Conner, Washington. This is the totem pole. If you ever drive on the reservation, you'll see this. This is our dental clinic here. This is the totem pole. On a totem pole, which piece of the totem pole, which is the most important? Someone said top. I heard a lot of base. The bottom's actually, in Native American culture, so my wife's dad for years was the chief of our tribe. And in Native American culture, when it comes to a totem pole, this is the most important place to be, the very bottom. Because as a leader, you want to be on the bottom, because your goal as a leader is not to make your way to the top. Yes, it's to hold up the most vulnerable, right? The elders of the church, the children in the church, the most vulnerable, right? And so as a leader, your goal is not to go to the very top. It's actually to be on the bottom. You want to help people feel like they belong before they believe. I'm guilty of this, 100% guilty. As an evangelist, there was a time where I was like, no, they got to believe, and then they can belong. But it's not like it's one or the other. They kind of happen at the same time. They're kind of blended. It's not black or white. Most of life happens in more of a gray area. So my goal is to help them feel like they belong before they believe. So one of the churches my wife and I went to for years until we moved to another church simply to help out with revitalization was actually North Cascade. I don't know if you were there that day, if you remember this or not. This happened before COVID. So there was a family, Donna and Robert. They had a couple of 3 kids, and we started doing Bible studies with them. And they started coming to church. In fact, when I first met her after the first Bible study, they had so many questions, and I told them about camp meeting. They actually came down Saturday from Burlington, Mount Vernon up there, all the way down to go to camp meeting for one day and have lunch with us and hang out with us. I mean, I normally don't do that, but they were really wanted to. And so he was in the Navy. He was a senior chief in the Navy, and he was getting ready to go on a 6-month deployment. And it happened to be on the Sabbath when our ministerial director, Bill Roberts, was speaking at the church. So I planned some things in advance. So I didn't spring things on anybody, but I invited Donna and Robert to come up, said to the church, Robert's a senior chief. He's about to leave to go in on a 6-month deployment, and his wife Donna is going to be here with the kids. I was in the Navy for 5 years. I did 2 6-month deployments to the Persian Gulf. I know how hard it is to be away for him, but I can imagine how hard it would be for her to have her husband gone. So I'd made some arrangements, and so I invited, instead of the elders, I invited any veterans, active duty, first responders to come up. And they prayed over Robert and Donna. So Robert and Donna are standing up there with me. And I told Donna, I said, when Robert's away for the next 6 months, I want you to know, Donna, that your church, that we've got your back. If your car breaks down while Robert's gone, I don't want you to call a mechanic. I want you to call the church, because in our church, we've got an auto mechanic. We're going to take care of you. If you need a contractor while your husband's gone, Don't call the contractor, call the, because we've got a contractor here, we're going to take care of you. And I went through, I'd already talked with some of the people, so I wasn't putting somebody on the spot. I said, anything you need while your husband's gone, we'll take care of you. We got your back, right? They weren't even Adventists, weren't even church members yet. But what we wanted to do is help them to feel like this was their church and that they belong in our church. And so here, if you want more information, if you want additional resources and training videos on church revitalization, church growth, you can snap that QR code. It'll actually take you to the conference website. And it'll take you to my page on the conference website. And if you ever want a free church, it's free because I work for you, a free church consultation, where I come in and meet with the board and I look at your numbers and kind of share the reality of where you're at. When you go to this site here from the QR code, you can actually, there's a thing online, you can sign up for a free church consultation. That email comes to me, and then I contact you or whoever submitted it, and we set up a time to connect and go over your church. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for today. We thank you for church growth. We thank you for the 124 churches, groups, and companies and the 21 schools we have here, 22, if we count the one on UW here in the Washington Conference, Lord. Every single church started with a vision, a prayer, a dream, being led by your Spirit. I want to pray for our pastors in our conference, that you would bless them. I want to pray for our head elders and our leaders and those who hold different departments, from treasurer to children's ministry, to women's ministry, to health ministry, to outreach, to Dorcas, to you name it, Lord. All of us have the same goal. We want to bring people to Jesus, and we want to go home. This isn't our home, Father. So I pray that you would bless us, give us wisdom, and convict us in the areas that you want us to improve upon. And we promise, God, to be both courageous and to listen to your call. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.
So what was something that stuck out to you from Tyler Long's talk? For me, I love this idea of belonging before believing, where we help guests engage in community as they explore their faith, that the community comes before the believing. What about you? Stop for a moment and think about the things that Tyler shared and how they can be applied in your own ministry. What was the big idea for you? How will you apply this in your own ministry context? Reflection practice is so powerful, which is why we emphasize it at the Propel Conference as well as here on the podcast. What are you inspired to do? So when this episode finishes, I encourage you to pause for 5 or 10 minutes and just let your mind wander and let God speak through Tyler into your life. What is the big idea that you can apply in your own ministry? This reflection time can be really powerful. Well, that's it for this episode. We'd love to hear from you. You can send an email to podcast@propelconference.org. And please join us for the upcoming Propel Conference coming to Silver Spring, Maryland, April 12 to 15. You can register now at propelconference.org. Special thanks to Tyler Long for speaking at the 2025 Propel Conference and to Advent Source for sponsoring this episode. This has been the Propel Podcast, inspiration and innovation to grow your church. The Propel Podcast is produced by the Sermon View crew, and the event recording services were provided by Adventist Learning Community. I'm Larry Witzel, wishing you God's richest blessing in your own evangelistic journey. Please join us again next time for another episode of the Propel Podcast.